My mom looked me in the eye and said, "We're not wasting $30,000 on experimental treatment when your sister's wedding is in 6 months." That was the moment I realized in my family, I had always been the backup plan, the one who didn't matter as much, the one whose child's life could wait. This is the story of how I learned that sometimes the people who should love you most are the ones teaching you how to survive without them. Let me take you back 6 months before that conversation. My son, Jacob, was 5 years old. He'd always been active, running, climbing, laughing so loud the neighbors would smile when they heard him. But that spring, something changed. He started limping. At first, I thought maybe he'd twisted his ankle at the playground. Kids do that. But the limp didn't go away. It got worse. Some mornings, he'd wake up crying because his leg hurt so much he couldn't stand. I took him to our pediatrician. She referred us to a specialist. The specialist ordered tests, x-rays, MRIs, blood work. Every appointment felt like waiting for a verdict. And finally, on a Tuesday afternoon in April, we got one. Jacob had a rare bone condition. The doctor used words I'd never heard before, medical terms that sounded like a foreign language. But the part I understood was this. His condition was degenerative. Without treatment, he would lose mobility in his leg, possibly permanently. Then the doctor said something that made my heart stop. He said, "The good news is, it's treatable. There's a surgical procedure with a very high success rate. The bad news is, it's not covered by most insurance plans. It's classified as experimental, even though we've been doing it successfully for years." I asked the question every parent asks. How much? The doctor looked uncomfortable. He said, with the surgery, hospital stay, and physical therapy afterward, you're looking at about $30,000. $30,000. I had about $12,000 in savings. My husband and I had been putting away money for years, for emergencies, for Jacob's future, for the things you can't predict. But $18,000 short felt like a canyon we couldn't cross. So I did what any daughter would do. I called my parents.
My father answered. I could hear the television in the background. He was watching his evening news the way he did every night at 6. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Dad, I need to talk to you and Mom about something important. Can you put me on speaker?" He did, and I'd told them everything. The diagnosis, the surgery, the cost, the timeline. The doctors said we should schedule it as soon as possible. Every month we waited increased the risk of permanent damage. When I finished, there was silence. Long enough that I thought maybe the call had dropped. Then my mother spoke. $30,000. That's a lot of money, sweetheart. Her voice was careful, measured. The way people sound when they're already looking for a reason to say no. "I know it is," I said. "But Jacob needs this, and I wouldn't ask if I had any other option. We have some savings, but we're short. I just need help covering the gap. I can pay you back over time." My father cleared his throat. "Let us think about it," he said. "This is a big decision. We need to look at our finances, talk it over. Give us a few days." I said, "Okay." I said, "Thank you." I said I understood, but something in his tone made my stomach tighten. It wasn't the warm, immediate, "of course we'll help" I'd expected. It was the voice you use with a salesman at your door. Polite, but already closing. Still, I tried to stay hopeful. These were my parents. They'd helped me before. When I needed a cosigner for my first apartment, when my car broke down and I needed a loan, they'd always come through, eventually, with conditions, with reminders of what I owed them, but they'd helped. I thought this would be different. This wasn't about me. This was about their grandson. Surely that changed everything. I was wrong.
2 days later, I was scrolling through social media while Jacob napped. That's when I saw it. My sister Emily's post. A photo of her hand, a diamond ring catching the light. The caption, "He asked. I said yes. Can't wait to marry my best friend." The comments were already flooding in. Friends I'd grown up with, relatives I hadn't talked to in years, everyone celebrating. And there, near the top, was my mother's comment. "We're so proud, Emily. We've been saving for this moment your whole life. You deserve the wedding of your dreams, sweetheart. Nothing but the best for our girl." I read it 3 times. "We've been saving for this moment your whole life." The words felt like they were written in a language I thought I understood, but suddenly didn't. Saving. They'd been saving. For a wedding. For Emily's wedding. While I was calling them asking for help to save my son's ability to walk, they were sitting on money they've been putting away for a party. I told myself I was being unfair. A wedding and a medical emergency are different things. Maybe they had separate accounts. Maybe the wedding fund wasn't liquid. Maybe there were reasons I didn't understand. But something about my mother's comment wouldn't leave me alone. Nothing but the best for our girl. Our girl. Singular. As if there was only one daughter who qualified for that title. As if I'd never been in the running. I waited another day. I didn't want to seem pushy, desperate, but Jacob's doctor had called to discuss scheduling, and I needed an answer. So I called my parents again. My father answered. "Sweetheart," he said. And I knew from that one word what was coming. There's a particular tone people use when they're about to disappoint you, but want you to make it easy for them. "We've talked it over," he continued, "and we just don't think it's responsible for us to spend that kind of money on something so uncertain. The doctors called it experimental, right? What if it doesn't work? What if there are complications?" I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, my mother took the phone. "We have to think about our own retirement," she said. "We're not getting any younger, and your sister's wedding is going to cost us a significant amount. We've committed to that. We can't just pull money from everywhere." Then she said something that made my blood turn cold. "Your sister's wedding is going to cost around $250,000. We've already put down deposits. Family comes first, and this is important to Emily. $250,000 for a wedding, while my son's surgery, $30,000, was uncertain and irresponsible." I didn't cry on the phone. I didn't yell. I simply said, "I understand. Thank you for considering it." And I hung up. Because in that moment, I finally understood what kind of family I'd been born into, and more importantly, where I stood in it. For the next week, I couldn't stop thinking about that number, $250,000. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, doing math in my head. If they had that much for a wedding, surely they had at least $30,000 to spare, unless they didn't actually have it. Unless they were going into debt for Emily's wedding, which would make their decision make more sense. Maybe they were already stretched thin. I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. Because the alternative, that they simply valued my sister's happiness more than my son's health was too painful to accept. 2 weeks after that phone call, my father asked me to help him with some paperwork. He was refinancing the house, and he needed someone to organize his financial documents for the mortgage broker. I said yes, partly because he was my father, and you help your parents when they ask, but partly, and I'm not proud of this, because I wanted to see. I wanted to know if they really couldn't afford to help us. I sat at their dining room table with folders full of bank statements, tax returns, investment accounts. I was just sorting them by year, putting them in order. But I couldn't help seeing the numbers. And that's when I found it. A savings account I'd never heard them mention. It was in both their names. The most recent statement was dated 3 weeks earlier. The balance had been $423,000. But that wasn't what stopped my breath. It was the transaction just below the balance. A transfer dated the same week I'd called them about Jacob's surgery. Transfer to wedding fund, $250,000. I stared at that line until the numbers blurred. They hadn't said they couldn't afford it. They said it wasn't responsible. But here was the truth, printed in black ink. They had over $400,000. They'd transferred $250,000 to Emily's wedding fund, and they'd left 17-year-old me to figure out how to save my son alone. I took a photo of that page with my phone. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I'd need proof later. Maybe I just needed to know I hadn't imagined it. Then I finished organizing the paperwork, handed it to my father, and drove home in complete silence. That night, I looked at the photo again, and I realized something I'd been avoiding for years. This wasn't new. The money was just making it visible. Emily had always been the golden child. I'd told myself it was because she was younger, or because she was more outgoing, or because she and my mother had more in common. But sitting there in the dark, looking at a bank transfer that valued her happiness at $250,000 while my son's health wasn't worth $30,000, I finally saw it clearly. It had never been about what we did or who we were as people. It was about who my parents decided we were before we even had a chance to choose. Emily was the dream, the one worth investing in, the one whose joy mattered. And I was the backup plan, the reliable one, the one who'd figure it out on her own because I always did. Once you see a pattern, you can't unsee it. It's like one of those optical illusions. Once someone points out the hidden image, you wonder how you ever missed it. That's what happened to me over the next few weeks. Everywhere I looked, I saw the pattern of my childhood reflected back at me. Emily wanted to study abroad in college, Paris for a semester. My parents paid the full cost: tuition, housing, travel, spending money. When I'd asked for help with my state university tuition, my father said, "You're smart, you'll get scholarships. And if not, loans build character. You'll appreciate your education more if you work for it." I did get scholarships. I worked 2 jobs. I graduated with $35,000 in student loan debt that I was still paying off. Emily graduated debt-free and spent the summer after college finding herself in Southeast Asia. My parents funded that too. When Emily wanted to buy her first car, my parents went with her to the dealership and helped her choose a brand new Honda. They paid for half of it as a graduation gift. When I needed a car for my job, I was commuting 40 minutes each way. I'd asked if they could help me with a down payment. My father co-signed a loan and told me, "This will help you build credit." Every month when I made that payment, my mother would mention it. "How's the car loan going? You're so responsible."
I was 23 when Emily crashed that Honda. She'd been texting while driving, totaled the car, walked away without a scratch. My parents' first concern, after making sure she was okay, was making sure she had transportation. They bought her a new car within the week, a nicer one. She's been through such trauma, she needs to feel safe driving again, my mother said. When I mentioned that I was still paying off my car loan, my father said, "That's different. You chose your car. Emily lost hers through no fault of her own." She was texting and driving, but somehow in my parents' eyes, that translated to no fault of her own. The pattern was everywhere once I looked for it. Emily's college apartment had been fully furnished by our parents. Mine had been whatever I could find at thrift stores and on Craigslist. Emily's graduation party had over 100 guests, catering, a photographer. Mine had been a family dinner at a restaurant where we split the bill. When Emily got engaged, my mother cried happy tears and immediately started talking about wedding plans. When I'd gotten engaged 5 years earlier, my mother's first question had been, "How are you planning to pay for it?" We'd had a small ceremony in my in-laws' backyard. 75 people, homemade food, flowers from a local grocery store. It was beautiful. But my mother had spent the entire day explaining to relatives that they wanted something intimate, as if our budget constraints had been an aesthetic choice. I'd made excuses for all of it over the years. Emily was the baby. Emily was more social. Emily had different needs. But the truth was simpler and more painful. Emily was the daughter they'd imagined, and I was the daughter who'd showed up instead. She was prettier, more outgoing, more like my mother, social, charming, able to light up a room. I was quiet, thoughtful. I liked books more than parties. I asked questions that made people uncomfortable. And somewhere along the way, my parents decided that made me less valuable. Or maybe they decided that before I'd even developed a personality. Maybe I'd simply been born second, and in my family, that meant being secondary. The surgery was just the latest data point, the clearest one, the one with stakes so high I couldn't ignore what it meant anymore. My parents had $400,000 in savings. They'd transferred $250,000 for a wedding that would last one day. And they'd told me $30,000 to help my son walk without pain was irresponsible. Those weren't financial decisions. Those were statements of value, and the statement was clear. Emily's happiness was worth $250,000. Jacob's health wasn't worth $30,000. And I had spent 33 years making excuses for people who'd been showing me exactly who they were all along.
While I was researching payment plans with the hospital and setting up a fundraising campaign, Emily's wedding planning went into full swing. And because we were still family, because I hadn't yet found the words to name what was wrong, I was still included. Bridal shower planning happened in the family group chat. My mother would send photos of venue options, 3 or 4 messages in a row. "What do you think of this one? The vineyard has beautiful views. It's $15,000 just for the rental, but Emily loves it." $15,000 for one day. I'd stare at my phone and think about how that was half of what I needed for Jacob's surgery. Then I'd type back, "Looks beautiful," because what else could I say? The dress shopping was worse. My mother invited me along, probably because it would look bad if I wasn't there. We went to a boutique where the cheapest dress cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Emily tried on 7 gowns, each one more elaborate than the last. My mother cried at every single one. "You're so beautiful," she kept saying. "My perfect girl. You deserve everything."
I stood in the corner of the boutique holding my phone because Jacob's doctor had texted me about scheduling a consultation to discuss alternative treatment options, meaning cheaper options, less effective options, the kind of options you consider when $30,000 might as well be $30 million. Emily chose a dress. $12,000. My mother didn't even blink. She handed over her credit card like she was buying groceries. Then she turned to me and said, "Isn't this exciting? Your sister's getting married." I smiled. I said yes, and excused myself to the bathroom and cried where no one could hear me. The bridal shower was at a country club. 80 women, 3-course lunch, party favors that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. I helped my mother set up. I smiled in photos. I played the games, the ones where you guess facts about the couple, where you write advice for the bride. When it was my turn to share advice, I said, "Always remember what really matters." Everyone smiled and nodded. My mother said, "That's lovely, dear." I don't think anyone knew I was talking to myself. After the gifts were opened, a kitchen's worth of expensive appliances, honeymoon spending money, gift cards to stores I'd never shopped at, my mother stood up to make a toast. "I want to thank everyone for celebrating Emily today. She's always been such a special girl. From the day she was born, we knew she was destined for beautiful things. And watching her find her perfect match, planning this perfect wedding, it's everything we've dreamed of as parents." She didn't mention me. That wasn't unusual. It was Emily's day. But something about the phrase, "everything we've dreamed of as parents," lodged in my chest like a stone. Because I was a parent too, and everything I dreamed of was watching my son run without pain. And that dream was worth less than my sister's tablescape. I lasted another hour before I left, claiming Jacob wasn't feeling well. It wasn't entirely a lie. He wasn't feeling well. He hadn't felt well in months, and I couldn't afford to fix it. I drove home thinking about numbers. $12,000 for a dress Emily would wear once. $15,000 for a venue, another $10,000 for flowers, my mother had mentioned. $5,000 for the photographer. The numbers kept adding up in my head, and every one felt like a rejection letter written in dollar signs. That night, Jacob couldn't sleep because his leg hurt. I sat next to his bed, holding his hand, wondering how you explain to a 5-year-old why his grandparents can spend enough money to change his life on a party that would be forgotten within a year. You don't. You can't. So instead, you tell him stories. You promise him it's going to be okay. You lie, because sometimes lying to your child is kinder than telling him the truth about the people who should love him most. And then, when he finally falls asleep, you sit in the dark and you make a decision.
I decided I was done being silent, done making it easy for everyone else. Done pretending that what was happening was normal or acceptable or just how families are. 3 weeks later, Emily's engagement party happened. At my parents' house, catered by a company that charged $200 per person. I wasn't going to go. I'd already decided. But my mother called me the morning of and said, "You have to come. People will ask where you are. What am I supposed to tell them?" So I went. Not for Emily, not for my parents, but because I'd decided that if I was going to finally say what needed to be said, I was going to do it in person. The party was exactly what I'd expected. 100 people in cocktail attire, champagne being passed on trays, a string quartet playing in the corner. Emily looked happy. She was happy. This wasn't her fault. She hadn't asked to be the favorite. She'd just accepted it as her due, the way you accept being born with good eyesight or strong teeth. A genetic lottery she'd won without trying. I watched my parents move through the crowd, proud and beaming. My father's arm around my mother's shoulders, her hand resting on Emily's back every time they stood together. The physical language of belonging. I realized I couldn't remember the last time either of them had touched me that way. I waited until things had calmed down, until most of the guests were on the patio. Then I found my mother in the kitchen directing the caterers. I asked if we could talk. She said, "Can it wait? I'm a bit busy, sweetheart." I said, "It's waited 33 years. It can wait a few more minutes, but I'd prefer not." Something in my voice made her stop. She told the caterers to take 5 minutes and followed me to my father's study. I texted him to join us. When he walked in, he looked confused. "Is everything okay?" "No," I said. "Everything is not okay. And I need to say that out loud before I spend one more day pretending it is." My mother's face tightened. "If this is about Jacob's surgery, it is about Jacob's surgery," I said. "But it's also about my college tuition, and my car, and my wedding, and every single time in my life I've needed help and been told I needed to be more responsible, or more independent, or more patient, while Emily got everything handed to her without question." My father raised his hands. "That's not fair." "I found your bank statement," I said. "The one showing you have over $400,000 in savings. The one showing you transferred $250,000 to Emily's wedding fund the same week I asked for $30,000 to help your grandson walk." Silence. Complete silence. My mother's mouth opened, then closed. My father looked at the floor. "You told me it wasn't responsible," I continued. "You told me it was experimental. You made me feel like I was asking for too much, but you had the money. You've always had the money. You just decided my son wasn't worth it." My mother found her voice first. "That money is for our retirement. We can't just give it away." "You didn't give it away," I interrupted. "You gave it to Emily for a party." "It's her wedding," my mother said, and her voice was rising now. "It's one of the most important days of her life. We've been planning this for—" "Jacob might not walk properly for the rest of his life. But you're right. The important thing is making sure Emily has white roses instead of pink ones." My father stepped between us. "You're upset, I understand, but you're being incredibly selfish right now. This is Emily's moment, your sister's moment. Can't you just be happy for her?" And that's when something inside me broke. Not in a loud way, in a quiet, permanent way, like ice cracking. "I'm being selfish," I repeated slowly. "I'm being selfish because I wanted you to help your grandson. But you're being generous because you're spending $250,000 on centerpieces and cake?" "It's not just about money," my mother said, and she sounded close to tears now. "You've always been so difficult, so dramatic about everything. You take things so personally. Emily doesn't do that. She appreciates what we do for her. She doesn't keep score." "I don't keep score," I said quietly. "I just finally learned to read the scoreboard. And it's been the same my entire life. Emily, everything. Me, figure it out yourself." My mother shook her head. "You're twisting everything. We love you both equally." "No," I said. "You don't. And I've spent 33 years making excuses for why. But there is no why. You just don't. And that's something I have to accept. But what I don't have to accept is pretending anymore." My father's voice hardened. "If you can't be supportive of your sister, maybe you shouldn't be here." I looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw a man who'd made his choice a long time ago, maybe before I was even born, maybe the moment Emily arrived and was easier, sunnier, more like what they'd wanted. "You're right," I said. "I shouldn't be here. I should be with my son, figuring out on my own how to save his future, the way I figured out everything else on my own." I turned to leave, My mother called after me. "You're overreacting. You always overreact. This is why we can't." I stopped at the door. I didn't turn around. I just said, "The reason you can't help me is because you don't want to. And the reason I'm leaving is because I finally believe that." I walked out of that study, through the party where no one noticed I was leaving because I'd never really been there to them anyway. I got in my car and I drove away from my parents' house knowing something fundamental had changed. I'd stopped waiting for them to see me, because you can't make people value what they've already decided isn't valuable. And that realization, as painful as it was, turned out to be the most freeing thing I'd ever learned. The next morning, I woke up and did something I should have done months earlier. I stopped waiting for my parents. I stopped hoping they'd change their minds. I stopped giving them power over my son's future. I researched every option: medical loans, payment plans, fundraising platforms. I created a crowdfunding campaign and wrote the hardest thing I'd ever written: a description of my son's condition and an admission that I needed help. I was terrified. I'd been raised to believe that asking for help was weakness, that needing support meant you'd failed somehow. My parents' voices were in my head. "People will judge you. They'll think you're irresponsible. They'll think you can't take care of your own family." But then I thought about Jacob, about his limp getting worse, about him asking me, in his small, serious voice, when his leg would stop hurting. And I realized something. Pride wasn't worth my son's pain. Reputation wasn't worth his future. And anyone who would judge a mother for trying to save her child wasn't someone whose opinion mattered anyway. I shared the campaign on social media. My hands shook when I hit post. Within an hour, the first donation came in: $50 from a former coworker I hadn't talked to in 3 years. Her message said, "I'm a mother too. We take care of each other." Then another, and another. My high school English teacher donated $100. A friend from college sent $25 with a note saying, "I'm sorry it's not more. I wish I could do more." Jacob's preschool teacher shared it with her entire network. People I barely knew sent $10, $20, $50. Each donation came with a message: praying for your family. Your son deserves this. Sending love and hope. I cried reading every single one. What broke me, in the best way, were the donations from complete strangers. People who'd never met Jacob, who'd never meet Jacob, who just saw a child who needed help and decided that mattered more than anything else. Within 2 weeks, we'd raised $10,000. A month later, $20,000. People kept sharing the campaign, kept adding to it. Some sent $5, some sent $500. Every amount felt like a hand reaching out in the darkness, saying, "You're not alone." 8 weeks after I posted that campaign, we hit $30,000. Not from my parents, not from my extended family who'd all been invited to Emily's $250,000 wedding. From teachers and coworkers and friends and strangers who believed that a 5-year-old boy deserved to walk without pain. From people who weren't related to us by blood, but chose to be family in the only way that actually matters. I called the hospital, I scheduled Jacob's surgery, and when they asked for payment, I said, "It's covered." Those 2 words felt like the most powerful thing I'd ever said. My parents didn't know about the fundraiser. I hadn't told them. I'd stopped including them in my life the day I walked out of that engagement party. They tried calling a few times. My mother left voicemails saying I was being unreasonable and that I was ruining Emily's wedding experience with this drama. I didn't respond because I'd finally learned something it had taken me 33 years to understand. You can't make people care. You can't logic someone into loving you the way you need to be loved. You can only decide what you're willing to accept.
and I was no longer willing to accept being seen as less than. The day of Jacob's surgery, my husband and I sat in the waiting room holding hands. It was early, 6 in the morning. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and anxiety. We'd been there since 5, doing pre-op, watching our son be brave in a way no 5-year-old should have to be. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother. "I heard through your aunt that Jacob is having surgery today. We would have liked to know. We'll be praying for him." I read it twice, then I put my phone away. Because whatever they were praying for, it wasn't the same thing I was praying for. They were praying for appearance, for the ability to tell people they'd been supportive, for the story to make them look good. I was praying for my son, and I was surrounded by people who'd actually help make this moment possible. That was the difference. And that difference was everything. Jacob's surgery was successful. More than successful, it was transformative. Within 3 months, the limp was gone. Within 6 months, he was running again. Really running, the way kids are supposed to run. Without pain, without hesitation. Just pure, joyful movement. I'd watch him at the playground racing other kids, laughing when he tagged someone in a game, and I'd feel this overwhelming wave of emotion. Gratitude, relief, pride, and something else. Something I didn't expect. Peace. Emily's wedding happened 3 weeks after Jacob's surgery. I saw the photos on social media. It looked exactly as expensive as it was. Beautiful, certainly. The kind of wedding you see in magazines. Hundreds of people, an elaborate setup, everyone dressed to perfection. I wasn't invited. My mother had called 2 weeks before the wedding and said, "Given everything that's happened, we think it's best if you don't come. Emily doesn't need the stress, and you've made your feelings clear." I'd said, "Okay." I didn't argue. I didn't try to explain that I'd never made it about Emily. Because by that point, I understood something crucial. They needed me to be the villain in their story, the difficult daughter, the one who'd ruined things by asking for help. Because if I wasn't the problem, then they'd have to look at their own choices. And people who spend $250,000 on a party while refusing $30,000 for a grandchild's surgery can't afford that kind of self-reflection. So I let them have their story, and I focused on mine. My story was better anyway. The people who donated to Jacob's surgery became part of our lives in unexpected ways. My former coworkers started joining us for coffee every few weeks. Jacob's teacher invited us to her family barbecue. One of the women who donated, a complete stranger who'd seen the campaign online, sent Jacob a card on his 6th birthday with a note that said, "So glad you're running again, buddy." These were the people showing up, not because they had to, not because of obligation or guilt or appearances, but because they'd chosen to care. 6 months after the surgery, I got a text from my mother. It was long, the kind of text that takes several messages to get through. She said she'd been thinking a lot and that she felt I'd overreacted, but that she was willing to move past it if I was ready to apologize for the things I'd said. She wanted me to apologize for asking for help, for pointing out that they'd chosen my sister's wedding over my son's surgery, for naming the pattern I'd spent a lifetime pretending didn't exist. I didn't respond, not out of anger, not even out of hurt anymore, but because I'd finally learned that some relationships aren't meant to be repaired. They're meant to be released. I didn't need my parents to acknowledge what they'd done. I didn't need them to apologize. I didn't even need them to understand why I'd walked away. I just needed to stop setting myself on fire to keep them warm. My husband asked me once if I regretted confronting them, if I wished I'd just stayed quiet and kept the peace. I thought about it for a long time before I answered. The peace was already broken. I just finally stopped pretending it wasn't.
Jacob doesn't ask about his grandparents much anymore. He's 6 now. His world is school and friends and soccer and his new bike. When he does ask, I tell him the truth in the simplest way I can. Sometimes people aren't able to love us the way we need, and that's sad, but it's not our fault. I don't want him to grow up making excuses for people who don't choose him. I don't want him to spend 30 years wondering why he's not enough, because he is enough. He always has been. And so was I. If you're listening to this and something in my story feels familiar, if you've ever been the child who wasn't chosen, the one who had to figure everything out alone, the one whose needs were always too much while someone else's were always justified, I want you to hear this. It's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. You weren't too sensitive or too demanding or too difficult. You were just born into a system that had already decided your value before you had a chance to prove it. And the people who should have protected you, who should have seen you, who should have chosen you, their failure to do that says everything about them and nothing about you. You deserved better. You still deserve better. And the most radical thing you can do is believe that. My parents spent $250,000 on my sister's wedding, but said $30,000 for my son's surgery was too much. And you know what I learned from that? That sometimes the family who refuses to save you is teaching you the most important lesson of all: how to save yourself. And when you do save yourself, when you build a life with people who choose you every single day, you'll realize something beautiful. You were never the problem. You were always the solution. If this story meant something to you, if it found you when you needed it, you're not alone. We're healing together. And that chosen family you're building, it's already started. Right here. Jacob is 7 now. He runs without thinking about it. He plays soccer. He rides his bike too fast down hills and gives me heart attacks at least twice a week. He's everything I fought for. Everything those strangers believed he deserved to be. And when he asks me about family, I tell him this: family isn't who you're born to, it's who shows up, who sees you, who chooses you again and again without keeping score. My parents taught me that lesson in the hardest way possible, but the hundreds of people who helped save my son taught me something more important: that love isn't about blood, it's about believing someone is worth fighting for. And we're all worth fighting for.